Hey everybody, we're going to continue with Jesus' trial in the Gospel of John, starting in chapter 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in the Aramaic, Gabbatha. So notice again, as I said in the last video, that there's very precise scenes of going in and out and in and out. And most commentators believe that these are pointing to the scapegoat ceremony from the Old Testament, in which the high priest went in and out several times, sent the scapegoat away and offered up, sent the scapegoat out into the wilderness and then offered the other goat up. The other thing I would point out about this section of the account is, if you compare this to Mel Gibson's The Passion, which is a fine movie and I recommend seeing it, Mel Gibson sort of dwells on the physical torture. But the gospel accounts generally don't dwell on them. And even here, there's not a dwelling on the torture. In fact, I think that John in particular wants us to notice how, as I said before, poised Jesus is through all of this. He's being tortured, and he doesn't speak when he thinks there's no honest question being asked, and he speaks with great calm when he does speak. So Jesus, again, is depicted as in charge here, despite the fact that the Romans and the Jewish people are wanting to kill him. One thing I would suggest is that there's just irony dripping off of every verse in this passage. And what I mean by that is, at almost every turn, there's some kind of statement. Like, well, let's just take, for example, the soldiers mocking Jesus. They make a crown, they put on the purple robe, they say, "Hail, King of the Jews." They mean it as a joke, but John wants us to see that it's the truth, and they don't know it. That's what I mean by irony. At every turn, when Pilate or the crowd or somebody else means it as a denigration, it actually turns out to be the truth. So here's another example. Pilate before said, "What is truth?" So the guy who kind of walked away from truth winds up declaring the truth, "Behold your king," and not even knowing it. So John wants us to see that through the human eyes who are seeing this scene. This is a vile man to be opposed. But if we will have our eyes opened, we will see that this is actually the unveiling of who Jesus is. He is the King of the Jews. He is the representative human being. And that's going on all through this section. Another thing to note about this section, I'm pretty convinced that Pilate thought maybe this guy was crazy, but Pilate clearly thinks this guy's innocent, and he would rather just give the crowd a little blood and let the guy go. I think that's why he flogs Jesus. I don't think he flogs him because he particularly cares, but he knows this crowd is frenzied and they want some blood, and he's going to try to give them that. But one of the things that I think we learn from this section is that this is a frenzied mob of the human race, and there is no reasoning with such a mob. They make their demands, and they will not be satisfied until they get their demands. And I don't think Pilate is necessarily a noble figure, but it seems as though he wants to do the right thing, but when it comes down to it, he's going to choose himself over the truth. I think what really clinches it for him is when the crowd says, well, you're no friend of Caesar's. This guy declares himself to be a king. He's a rebel, and you're not going to deal with him. Caesar's going to look into that. I think he immediately thinks, uh-oh, I got to cover my career. And so he chooses his career over the truth. And I think that's ultimately why he decides to go ahead and have Jesus crucified. Another irony that I think is very important is he brings him out and he says, behold the man. And commentators have pointed out maybe a lot of references. Samuel brings out Saul and says, behold the man, when he declares him king. So maybe it's a reference to the anointed king. I'm convinced by some commentators who say that behold, obviously it's an irony. Pilate doesn't mean it this way, but theologically and ironically and accidentally, he's prophesying the truth. In Jesus, as he is submitted to the Father and giving himself in love for the human race, we see what a human being is meant to be. A human being is meant to be somebody who pours themselves out in love for others in obedience to God the Father. And so we saw a human in Adam, and we've seen glimpses of decent men throughout the Scripture and decent women throughout the Scripture. But in Jesus Christ, on that platform in Jerusalem, submitting to the Father and loving the world, we see what a human being is meant to be. We get a declaration that is a human being, and that is what Jesus has redeemed us all to be, submitted to God the Father in love for others, regardless of the cost. So again, that statement, behold the man, is not just, or here he is, guys, but John, the theologian, the writer of the gospel, wants us to see much deeper meanings in all of that. Let me point out one final irony. The ESV says, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement. So it seems as though Jesus is going to give his final pronouncement. Judges, Roman rulers, when they were giving a final judgment, this is sort of like the gavel, they sat down on those thrones, those marble thrones, and pronounced their official verdict. Now, some people point out that in the Greek there's an irony. It says he sat down. It could say he sat him down. It may be that Pilate, like the Roman soldiers, seats Jesus on the judgment seat there in an irony to say, okay, I'm going to go along with this mocking all the way to the end. Be that as it may, there's no doubt, whether that's true or not, there's no doubt that John, the gospel writer, wants us to see that this human court, this human being, as the leading representative of Jewish people and Roman people, is going to judge God and judge the man Jesus, who is God. And the supreme irony is that one day that man will judge every person who has ever lived. That was the declaration of the early church, that Jesus Christ is the judge of all men and that God raised him from the dead. Miracle of miracles, though, is that Pilate, had he repented, Judas, had he repented, anyone in that crowd who was guilty, the Roman soldiers who mocked him, the wonder of wonders is that that man, Jesus, who is the Son of God, who will come to judge the living and the dead, would forgive those who crucified him. Indeed, came so that they could do that, so that he could forgive them. So may we know him as our judge now and know his forgiveness and proclaim that forgiveness to others. Amen.